are in part 2 of a message series called The End Commandments. And for those of you that may be new to the Pointe, first of all, I'm Pastor JB. I didn't introduce myself to some of you if you didn't know who I was, and I'm the lead pastor here. And here at the Pointe, when we do a message series, we basically take a topic and we look at it for a number of weeks in order to hopefully give to us kind of bite-sized morsels of things that we can apply. And because I know that if I gave you 15 points, you wouldn't remember the first 3 probably. So why not give you something that we can kind of camp on for a day, and then we do, over a number of weeks, we'll kind of get through. And this series is called The End Commandments, and this is part 2. In fact, I welcome you. We really started to get some things together with our website. So I'm going to ask you to go to your website, and if you have not, at this point, if you've not seen the first part of our series, I ask you to go to the website, which is the Pointe Online. If you would, thank you so much. thepointeonline.org. There's a section that says messages. You can listen to the messages right now. We don't have our video component up, but if you are on your iPhone, you can go there and listen to it. You can download it to your computer, but you can definitely listen to it. And I encourage you to listen to part 1 of this series, because in part 1, we kind of set the foundation for what we call the End Commandments. And you're going to today understand what we mean by the End Commandments, because there's something about this end that we're going to talk about. And so today is part 2, and last week what we did, and I'm not going to be able to go into great detail, but we set up and we kind of talked about the End Commandments and kind of where we're kind of starting today and how we got there. And in fact, what we talked about is the fact that Jesus came, and when Jesus came, he did something that was brand new. In fact, that kind of goes back to a series called Brand New that we did a little earlier this year, which you can also go and listen to on thepointeonline.org. And in this series, we talked about, and we talked a little bit about last week, Jesus came and he did something incredibly brand new, something that not had been done before. And in so doing, he set up a system by which we can have a relationship with God that was unlike anything else. It was brand new. And as he did this, what Jesus did is he punctuated this brand new thing by dying on the cross and then coming back from the dead. And his resurrection signified something incredibly brand new. And in fact, what Jesus did in coming back and separating himself from something that was in the Old Testament, from the law and the religion of Judaism, he unhitched this brand new thing from that. And that's what we talked about last week, that he unhitched this brand new thing from anything that they had thought about before, the 600 plus laws that they had, the commandments, the Old Testament. Jesus unhitched himself. I didn't say this last week, but it was important that he unhitched himself from Judaism, because in around 70 AD, the temple was absolutely destroyed by an attack for what the Romans thought would be an insurrection, and they totally decimated the temple. And in so doing, did away with what people knew as Judaism and this whole kind of Orthodox Judaism and the whole temple model. That whole thing went away. And because Jesus had unhitched himself, had he not, there would be no Christianity. If we were hitched to and we had to do everything from the Jews, and we had to be a Jew in order to be a Christian, it would have all died in 70 AD. But it didn't happen. Jesus unhitched what he did. And he unhitched it from anything that was there to start something brand new. And what we talked about last week is that the believers that were there, many of them like you, Gentiles, there may be some of Jewish descent here, but many of them, like most of us, were Gentiles. And it was important for them to understand what was going on, because they simply believed in a risen Jesus, somebody that they saw crucified on a Friday. And then the disciples had lunch with him a couple of days later. I mean, it was something that was totally mind-blowing. And here you had Jesus come back. He actually, through his resurrection, defeated death. And the Gentiles basically knew this. They didn't know anything really. They may have heard of Adam and Eve, I don't know. And Moses wasn't important to them. The 600 plus commands, all they knew was Jesus died and he rose. And there are those of us that have seen him. There are eyewitness accounts, and that's what we have. And so we want to have you kind of go back to that same mindset. Pretend you are part of this first church, where all you had was your incredible belief and knowledge that you have seen the risen Christ and that you want to follow. But remember, Paul had not written anything. Paul, who, if you've read the Bible before, is actually attributed to him, is about half of the New Testament. But Paul had not, he didn't write it for about 25 years, and it probably didn't go out and widely distributed until 30 or 35 years. So you didn't have that. There was nothing in terms of the Gospels or anything. All you had was the fact that Jesus had risen from the dead. He had said something about one command in a few different forms, but love one another, right? So love God, love your neighbor, and love your enemy. That's basically his one law, and that's what he had. And you, I'm sure, if you were in the first century church, you're thinking, okay, what else do I need to do? What else is there? What else can I hang my hat on? What else do I have to know? And all they had was the knowledge of his resurrection. They had this idea that love was central to everything that they did. And then they had a few things that Jesus said that they orally would pass on. They would talk and tell them, here's what Jesus said. These are the things that Jesus said. And the things that Jesus said, in the midst of what they would consider just this resurrection religion, this religion that was based on the resurrection of this man. And again, if somebody can predict their death and their resurrection and then pull it off, I'm following him. And so here they are wanting to follow him, but what did they have? They had some of the words of Jesus, and this is what we're talking about when we talk about the 10 commandments. There are things that Jesus said. And there are 5 things that we're going to kind of look at that at various times in his ministry, Jesus said these things. And most of these things started with this idea of thou shalt not. In fact, the N stands for not. Everybody say not. So there are things that we shall not do. And Jesus would say this, and these would be the things that they would focus on. Here's what you should not do. These are things that thou shalt not. And Jesus, and again, a number of occasions, these 5 things came up. We're going to talk about one of them today. And in subsequent weeks, I and the communication team will talk about the rest of these things. But today, we're going to talk about the first one that we talked about, something that Jesus said over and over again. And here's what's interesting about it. Most of what Jesus said not to do, the disciples looked at him and was like, that's impossible. In fact, for the disciples, many of the things that Jesus said not to do, they were not able to truly do them. They did not really realize their ability to not do the things that Jesus said until Jesus died and rose from the dead. It was only after that that they were able to not do this. But nonetheless, the Gentile believers, as we are in this first time, in these first years after Jesus had died, rose again, went back to heaven, I want you to put yourself in their place, and here's what we have to go on. Jesus rose, and we know that. And then he gave us some ideas that we should love one another, love our enemies, love our neighbor, love God. And then there's some things he wants us not to do that we're going to focus on as we go through. And so this first one that Jesus talked about was, thou shalt not fear. Thou shalt not fear. In fact, he says, fear not. Fear not. Now, fear not, that's like, yeah, you know, and if you need to understand what I mean is, don't be afraid. That's what Jesus said. Don't be afraid. Don't fear. Now, it didn't really make a whole bunch of sense to them. And again, as Jesus talks to them, it's interesting that he says it over and over again. There are a number of instances where you go through the Bible, great study for you to do. If you go through the accounts of Jesus walking among his disciples, the number of times that he said, fear not, don't fear, fear not, do not fear, do not be afraid. And yet, it was like, what do you mean, don't be afraid? In fact, in the scripture we're going to go to today, we're going to go to actually a few portions of scripture as accounted by Matthew, who was a tax collector, and Jesus changed his life and he began to follow. We see Jesus is talking to them, and again, I encourage you, if you're writing down and for your study at home, go to the 10th chapter of Matthew and read what Jesus says to them. And it's really interesting. Before we go to the verse here, what Jesus basically says to them is, listen, I want you to go out, and you're going to do incredible things. You're going to heal people like I've healed people. You're going to touch people, they're going to be delivered. You're going to do all these things. But while you do them, people are going to spit on you, and people are going to flog you. You're going to be arrested. Things are going to happen to you. I mean, you're going to be like sheep amongst wolves. You may have heard that saying before. It's from the 10th chapter of Matthew, when Jesus is describing to those who are his disciples what I need you to do and what's going to happen. So I need you to go out there, but I need you to understand that when you go out there, you will not be favorably looked at. People are not going to like you. People are going to do things. They're going to throw things at you. They're going to try to, in some senses, kill you. And so with this as a backdrop, the 28th verse of Matthew, 10th chapter, 28th verse, it says this. Jesus says, in the midst of this, don't be afraid. What? Didn't you just tell me that my life may be at stake and that they're going to flog me? Do you understand? I mean, that's going to hurt. You say, don't be afraid? Jesus says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid of those who will, those who the body cannot, those who will, those who can kill. That's right, no. Well, I think I left the word out here. Anyway, don't be afraid of those that cannot kill the soul. They can touch the body, but they can't kill the soul. Don't be afraid. And then he says, rather be afraid. Hold on, Jesus, hold on. You said don't be afraid, and then you say be afraid. Hang with me here. Don't be afraid of those that can hurt the body, but they can't kill the soul. But be afraid of the one, capital O-N-E, who can destroy both soul and body in hell. So he kind of says, okay, now this is again, the backdrop for this is he just told them all these things that could possibly happen to them, but don't be afraid. Don't get it. And then he further says, listen, be afraid of the one, and again, fear, it talks about respect and reverence, but be afraid rather of the one who can destroy both soul and body. And he goes on further in his teaching, he says, listen, are not two sparrows old for a penny? Are they, they're pretty much, they're not really that valuable. They're not really something that people threw those, sparrows were not that valuable. And so he says, listen, yet not one of those sparrows will fall to the ground outside of your Father's care. Then not one of those sparrows will fall to the ground without God knowing that they fell. Think about this. Jesus is trying to give them a way of thinking about and not being afraid. He says, fear not. It's one of the commands. It's what we as Gentile believers, again, without a Bible, Paul had not written it yet, the Gospels had not been written yet. All we have is, remember Jesus said, and he said it over and over again, fear not. For the sparrows that fly, which aren't worth much, God sees them. He sees every one of them. And none of them hit the ground without the Father understanding. None of them hit the ground outside of your Father's care. Your Father's care, the one who loves you. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Interesting that Jesus says that not only do I care about the sparrows, and none of them fall out of the sky without God knowing, our Father knowing, but our Father has even numbered, not counted, he's numbered. You ever think about that? Counted means, we kind of count and we get a sum. Numbered says, that's hair number 1, that would be hair number 74. That's what God literally has our hairs numbered, which is so incredibly intimate that he knows us. So don't be afraid. You're worth more than many sparrows. So they're at this point, they're like, okay, hold on a second. You did say that God cares about the sparrows, and he cares about us more than the sparrows. But he did watch the sparrows fall and hit the ground, though. Didn't he? I'm not sure I can really do this, Jesus. And so Jesus is talking to them, and maybe they still didn't quite get it, because a couple of chapters prior to this, they had an experience where Jesus was really saying some of the same things. And Jesus would reiterate things over and over again. Didactic means that, so he would say things that, anybody get something on the third time? It's why some people, it's why we may repeat a grade. Because we might get it better the second time, and it's okay. And Jesus would come back and kind of remedially get them to understand things. Well, 2 chapters before this, we see an interesting thing that happened, and it kind of was a precursor to this. And maybe Jesus was kind of hoping that if you remember what I said before and you're remembering what I'm saying now, maybe the two will go together. And so, we're going to go back to the 8th chapter. Matthew gives us an account where Jesus Jesus is dealing with his people, and he's, as he always was, he was near the Sea of Galilee. And this verse says here, he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Now, again, Jesus is in the boat, and the reason why Jesus was often in the boat and was often around the Sea of Galilee was the only way he could get away from the crowds was in a boat. And he didn't have like an entourage of people and a special police escort or tricked out escalades or anything. He had to deal with the people, and the only way he can get away from the people was to get into the boat and to travel that way. So Jesus gets into the boat, and the disciples follow him into the boat. Goes on to say, suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. Now, some of you may remember this story, but stay with me a little bit here. And so they're in the boat. The storm just kind of flows up into this valley, and again, all kinds of winds are coming, and so they're on the Sea of Galilee, and the storm furiously begins. And at this point, the Bible says, Matthew says, but Jesus was sleeping. Now, this was Matthew's perspective. I almost think that Jesus was kind of like sleeping, kind of like we sleep sometime. My oldest son, I can remember when he was a baby, you could hear him jump out of the crib, run down the hall, and open the door. And you knew that if Jordan thought you were awake, he was going to start conversing with you. He was going to start talking. And so what we would do is we'd hear him get out, and while this was happening, fake like you're sleeping. And you know, parents, there's all kinds of commotion going on. The kids are doing all kinds of things, and you hear them say, be quiet, Mom's sleeping. Dad's sleeping. I think it was probably like that for Jesus. That he was sleeping, at least in their perspective, Jesus is sleeping. Jesus had something he was trying to let them know. I got a feeling he may or may not have been sleeping, but Jesus was there, and what they perceived was that he was sleeping. Listen to what happens. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. Oh, that storm, and that furious storm is there. And listen to what Jesus says to them. He replied, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? Did you not, Jesus, read verse 24? It was a furious storm. Did you not understand? It's a furious storm. What do you mean, why are we afraid? Jesus asked them, why are you afraid? Why are you afraid? And then he got up. And he rebuked the winds and the waves. And it was completely calm. At this point, the men were amazed. And they asked the question, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. What kind of man is this? You know what kind of man this is? This kind of man is a Superman. He's a Superman, and that the winds and the winds and the rain would obey him. He's a Superman. I mean, it's exactly what's happened. You're in there with Jesus. Why are you afraid? And they saw that, oh my goodness, this is incredible. What kind of man? In fact, Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, wasn't an actual disciple, thought that he may have gotten his information from Peter, but Mark writes in his Gospel, he writes something, in fact, what Mark does when he's talking about this same account is that he uses both the noun and the verb form of the Greek word for fear. And in other words, what Mark says to them, at this point, when Jesus gets up, he calms the waves, he calms the rain, he calms the sea, he rebukes all those things. They're incredibly amazed. What Mark says is that they actually feared a great fear. In other words, they were fearful when the storm was raging, and they were more fearful when Jesus stopped it. And at that point, they were more fearful of, it's like, okay, we're fearful about the storm, but do you see what this guy just did? And here there were some things that were incredibly difficult for them to understand, and their fear was of, whoa, look at what Jesus just did. Here's a situation in which I was fearful for my life, and now this Superman did what? And they feared with a great fear. And so that's in the 8th chapter. Just a couple of chapters before the 10th chapter, when Jesus says, here's what you're going to go through, but don't be afraid. Just like he said, why are you afraid? And then another 2 chapters hence, Matthew tells of another account where they had, remember where there was a crowd of people and they were trying to figure out, hey, listen, where are these people going to eat? And Jesus said, you feed them. We can't feed them. No, you can feed them. And they begin to take the loaves and the bread and they pass them out. Anybody remember that story with feeding of people? One person, me and my mom. Okay, great. So does everybody kind of recall that there was a feeding of like 5,000 men? And anybody remember that? Okay, all right, this is good. All right. So it's that account where we see this happening, where the disciples, they're probably kind of feeling good about themselves. Look what we did. We fed all these people. We did this, and we did an incredible thing. And it's after this that this verse we're going to pick up in the 14th chapter of Matthew. It says this: immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. You know why he had to make them get into the boat? Because the last time he had them get in the boat, you remember what happened? You would have to make me get into the boat too. Yes? Anybody here with me on that one? Okay, the last time, and my memory's clear enough. This wasn't that long ago. The last time we got into the boat, Jesus, you're always doing something now. Come on now. But immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And so Jesus, I can see him getting into the water, about waist deep. And, Peter saying, no, Jesus, you get in. No, Peter, go ahead, get in the boat. No, Jesus, go ahead. Jesus, no, Peter, get in the boat. And then pushing the boat off and saying, okay, I'm going to dismiss the crowd. I'll see you. So now they're in the boat by themselves without Jesus. Jesus goes back. He dismisses the crowd. I'm sure they thought, well, we're going to go ahead of him. He said to go ahead over there. I'm not even going to ask how he's going to get there because he seems to get wherever he needs to get to. And the disciples get pushed off in the boat, and here they are in the boat. Jesus goes up to the mountain to pray, the Bible says. And he says after he had dismissed them, he went up to the mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, so Jesus is praying, and Jesus could pray for a while, and he in fact did. In fact, if you put the Gospels together and you kind of see this account, they were out on the ocean, out on the sea, out on this body of water for hours. And it says later that night, Jesus was there alone, praying on the mountain, and he had sent the disciples in the boat. And here's where this story starts having like that music starts coming with that low kind of note. So something's getting ready to happen. And the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by waves because the wind was against it. So here we go again. We're out here and this thing there's another storm. And now we're out here and Jesus is not in the boat with us. Anybody here, would you be scared? Okay, yes. I'd be scared. I don't swim well. And there's all this stuff going on. Jesus is not in the boat. But it's interesting that as they're in the boat, way out there, and the scriptures will tell you that they were toiling and trying to row. Listen, Jesus said to get there, let's row. I mean, it was probably something like, the first rowing machine, because they were rowing and rowing and rowing, but going nowhere. But Jesus said, go, we're going to do it. It's interesting what happens here shortly before dawn, because again, they had been toiling throughout the night. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them. He went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. Wouldn't you be? They were absolutely terrified because Jesus is walking on the lake. And so they see him out there and they say, it's a ghost. It's a ghost. It's a ghost, they said. And they cried out in fear. They were scared. They cried out in fear. Here we go again. But Jesus immediately said to them, look what you're doing. You fail. Again. What are you scared of? But see, they didn't fully understand what was going on and who they had been with. And who, even though he wasn't in the boat, knew that they were in the boat and was somehow watching what was going on. And see, they're not so different than us, because many of us have been in situations where we feel Jesus has fallen asleep or he's not in the boat. I mean, when you think about the first account that we looked at in chapter 8, they had proof. They saw Jesus asleep. Their Lord is asleep. Some of us have felt the same way. Jesus, you're not where I think you should be when I think you should be there. Are you sleeping? Jesus, you're not in the boat with us. Are you understanding what's going on? I'm afraid. And the disciples, in a very natural way, they were absolutely afraid. And Jesus said, here we go again. You fail. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage. It is I. Take courage. I'm here. Take courage. I know your situation. Take courage. I am seeing what's going on with you. I am here. Take courage. It is I. And then he said to them, the thing that we said, this end commandment that we're talking about today, do not be afraid. Don't be afraid. And so here's a lesson I want you to think about as we think about Jesus and what he was trying to tell the disciples on these three separate occasions. In Matthew 8, we see it in Matthew 10, we see it in Matthew 12, or Matthew 14, we see this. And what he's trying to say here is this: you don't have to be afraid, even when there's something to be afraid of. You don't have to be afraid, even when there's something to be afraid of. And again, they didn't get this at the time. It wasn't until, again, if you look at throughout the scripture, go to the Garden of Gethsemane when they arrest Jesus. And Jesus said, no, put the sword down. They ran. And they ran because they were scared. They were afraid. They had fear. It wasn't until after that they started to realize this lesson and what Jesus had said in terms of fearing not. And so let me give this to you in a different form. I'm going to ask you to repeat it with me. I want you to read this with me, and I want you to read this with me because, again, and whether you believe it and whether you're here because somebody trapped you or you lost the bet or somebody's promising you lunch, I want you to read this, and I want you to hear yourself say this because it's an incredibly important aspect of what Jesus is asking us to do. It's an incredibly important thing for you, Gentiles, who are just coming into the knowledge. There's not the writings of Paul. The Gospels haven't been written. All we have is what Jesus has said. The fact that he rose, he said to love, and he said, fear not. I want you to read it. I want you to hear yourself say this. Let's read this together. I don't have to be afraid, even when there's something to be afraid of. Read that again. Even. Doesn't matter what it is. There are those of you right now who are in the midst of situations where someone, something is coming after you. And again, whether it's sickness or finances or relationship, whether it's a test or whatever, you don't have to be afraid. I don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. And there's a reason why. Because the disciples, not too far hence, not too far after this whole idea, they saw their Lord, their Messiah, nailed to a cross. They saw him, again, wrongfully convicted, executed in front of a crowd. But in 2-3 days, on that third day, he got up, and over 500 people saw him. He gets up and they see resurrected Christ. Because see, here's what I want you to understand. Once they saw this resurrected Christ, once they encountered him, once they knew and understood, they began to put things together from what Jesus said. You don't have to fear. You don't have to fear. And why? Because Jesus did something and he conquered what ultimately most are incredibly scared of, and that is death. The finality of it, and no one ever came back. And that was what people, that's not what they did. People died and they stayed dead. But God, through his son, he overcomes death. He absolutely defeats it. And so when they lost their fear of death, they feared not. And it's interesting because this idea for them became what they were able to hold on to. They didn't have a Bible. There was no New Testament. But what they did have, again, was the resurrected Jesus, his commands to love God, love your neighbor, love your enemy, and these end commandments, starting with fear not. And they didn't have to fear. They could abide by fearing not when they knew that their Jesus had resurrected from the dead, when he had overcome, again, what most were fearful of. And in the first century, this became the hallmark for those that were in the followership of Jesus, those that were in the way, those that were considered Christ followers. For they encountered such torment. They encountered a lot of persecution for simply saying, "I believe in Jesus." It is in this time that there's a gentleman who was he was kind of an apologist, and he actually was a historian that wrote probably right around 160, 170 AD. So we're talking 100 years plus after the actual events of Jesus' death. And you had Christians who were standing up for who they believed in. They were standing up for Jesus. They were standing up for the resurrected Savior. And they were consistently losing their life. And this gentleman, his name is Claudius Galenus, and he wrote something, and let me just tell you, as he was writing this, he was a physician of sort, and he would also write about things, and in this time, you were not allowed to do autopsies. And they wanted to know something about death and how people died. And it's interesting, they would go to the places where people were being killed. And in this case, Christians were being killed. In fact, the writings of Galenus, you'll see often his talking about Christians, because Christians, again, as we talked last week, if the Tiber River or was overflowing or wasn't high enough, throw a couple Christians to the gods. It was thought of that they were the cause of everything, and because of their faith and their boldness and their lack of fear, because they feared not, Christians were often facing death and persecution. But as they were looking at how people were dying, because they couldn't, again, examine dead bodies, they would go to these arenas, they would go to these places where Christians were being killed, and they could look at people as they were dying. And what he said in this one account that I'm going to share with you right now is amazing because of what he sees. He says this: "For fearlessness of death and the hereafter is something we witness in them, Christians, every day." As he saw Christians die, there was no fear. There was no fear of what was coming on. There was fearlessness. As he saw these people being killed, being persecuted, being tortured, there was no fear. Because as Jesus' followers, Jesus had already conquered death. In other words, Jesus had been there and done that. It's amazing as we can think about what Jesus did for us and how he was able to conquer death. For that first century church, and for those of us who are now pretending to be part of that, we don't have to fear because Jesus has already overcome it. It kind of reminds me as children, if you hung out in groups of kids and you kind of run around and get in trouble. It was always interesting that there was typically someone who was a little bolder, who would go, and they'd say I remember this one area, I was behind where Mr. Rachel used to live, and it was like you could jump onto the roof of the garage that was like on adjacent property. It was probably Mr. Well, anyway, I won't even talk about it. But anyway, there was this, you could jump over this little gap onto the roof. And it's interesting, it's not something that you would necessarily do on your own. But how many of us had a brave friend who would be the first one to try stuff? All right, anybody have a brave friend? Or how many of you were the brave friend who would try stuff first? You're just crazy? Yeah, yep, there you go. And so it's interesting, when they would run and jump and go over, you kind of felt like, I can do that. I can do that. Yeah, I can do that. Now, I'm not going to tell all the details because in our household, we can still get spankings even though we're 51 years old for stuff that we did when we were little, so I'm not going to give the details. But it's interesting how following somebody who you say, well, I can do that. I can do that because I just saw them do that. I know he's been there, he's done that. Well, Jesus is saying the same thing. I have overcome death, so you do not have to fear. You don't have to fear anything. You don't have to fear sickness. You don't have to fear calamity. You don't have to fear financial hardships. You don't have to fear relationship failures. You don't have to fear tests or trials or tribulations. You don't have to fear it because I've been there, I've done that, I've conquered it all, so fear not. That's what Jesus is saying. I've gone before you. I've done this thing. Because I know what it's like. I know what you're going through. There's nothing that you're going through that I have not been touched with. So you don't have to fear because I've already overcome all of it. And that's what he wanted his disciples to see. And it wasn't until he had died and then rose again that they began to be able to hold on and grasp that Jesus did this. He's been there. He's done that. But that's the same thing he's asking us to do. Understand that we don't have to fear. Fear not. He said, fear not. That is exactly what I want you to do. Fear not. Because I've already overcome everything that you're going to go through. I am with you. And even when it feels like I'm not, I'm with you. I understand what you're going through. Fear not. You do not have to be afraid, even when there's something to be afraid of. Because he's already overcome everything that we could be fearful of. So I'm hoping that as we think about this almost impossible thing to do, what do you mean don't be afraid? There's something to be afraid of. We're not denying that. He's not asking us to pretend like it's not there. As I look at people who are battling right now, there's two people that I know in my life right now who are battling in stage 4 cancer. And that just seems scary to me. Anybody else, does that seem... I mean, I'm just being real. As you think about what they're going through, but Jesus said, you don't have to fear. I've been there. I've done that. It's interesting for me as you know, again, as you get older and you start seeing that there are loved ones who have made the trip, right? And when I say that, there are loved ones who have died and they've gone on to glory. It seems like, over there is taking on a different flavor. Over there is taking on different form. And Jesus is saying, ultimately, understand, I've already given a pathway. I've already conquered this. This is, in a sense, old news. I've already overcome this. You don't have to fear it because I've already taken the sting of it out. You don't have to fear it because I've already done it. You don't have to fear it because I've done it, I'm giving you a way to do it. And that's what I believe Jesus is saying. And as he was saying to his disciples throughout his time with them on earth, don't fear, don't be afraid, fear not. Don't fear, don't be afraid, fear not, because I've overcome things. He's saying the same thing to you. And now we have even more to go on, that God has preserved these writings, preserved these ancient manuscripts that we can be able to see what exactly he's talking about. But he has said to us, fear not. Excuse me. And as first century believers, as believers we're pretending to be, where all we have is the resurrected Christ, the command to love, and what Jesus said, this first one that we're talking about, don't fear. That's where you have to go on. Don't fear. And because Jesus lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know who holds the future. And my life is worth living because he lives. I mean, think about the reason why we don't have to fear is that he has risen. What we celebrated just a few weeks ago on Easter is the reason why we don't have to fear. This first end commandment of fearing not may seem impossible for some of you as you go through whatever you're going through, but rest assured that Jesus has already made the way. Jesus has already conquered whatever it is that you're going through. He's already given you a means by which you don't have to fear, just go through it. I encourage you today to make that happen.